Bernard Arnault, the luxury magnate who jockeys for the title of the world's richest man with Elon Musk, reserved, mysterious, and a true master of the financial market. With his skills, he acquired high-end companies like Moet, Louis Vuitton, Dior, Tiffany, and many others. However, there was one brand that the billionaire couldn't buy, even with a truckload of money. And in this video, you're going to find out what the biggest defeat of the world's richest man was and why he couldn't achieve this feat. To begin, we'll have to go back in time a bit, 1999. In that year, Bernard Arnault began building his luxury empire, and in general, he operated in the same way, quietly, slowly, and lethally. Instead of simply buying all the shares of the companies he desired, the billionaire started his strategy by purchasing small batches of shares. Then he moved on to a larger batch, eventually gaining what's called a blocking minority. The term blocking minority usually refers to minority shareholders who hold a significant amount of shares in a publicly traded company, giving them the power to influence important decisions of the company, even if they don't have the majority of shares. This can happen due to specific corporate governance rules or shareholder agreements that grant these minority shareholders certain rights or special powers, like protection to prevent the majority shareholder from overpowering the others. A blocking minority typically occurs when one holds a quantity of shares below the majority, but enough to block important decisions such as mergers, acquisitions, changes to the corporate charter, or the election of board members. With this power, Arnault begins to undermine the development of the desired company. He creates conflicts among shareholders and between shareholders and the company's management, casting doubt on the future of the desired company, until the share prices start to drop to a level that suits his interests. At this point, he swoops in and launches what's known as a hostile takeover bid. Instead of making an offer for the shares directly to the business's management, he starts negotiating directly with the shareholders individually. This is because typically, the value he proposes is quite different from what the majority, which makes up the management, desires. And in some cases, the management simply doesn't want to sell their shares. However, usually by approaching the shareholders unofficially, Arnault gradually manages to craft a favorable agreement for himself, to the point where the majority is left with no choice, as he builds power that can make a company's situation quite delicate. After all, the market devalues companies with internal conflicts and doubts about their own future. An extremely predatory strategy, and one that almost always worked. But it didn't work with one specific company, Gucci. That's right, the last story told here on the channel. After acquiring some important fashion brands, with Louis Vuitton as its flagship, Bernard Arnault began to employ his tactics against the Italian fashion house. A few years earlier, the majority of Gucci's shares had been sold to a group of Arab investors who managed to rescue the company from the crisis created by the founding family. During that time, Gucci's stock value had seen a huge surge. In the previous 5 years, the share price had risen from $32 to $56, the result of a very well-executed effort by CEO Domenico De Sole and designer Tom Ford. But while they were enjoying the fruits of their hard work, the market shark Bernard Arnault entered the scene, wanting to add Gucci to his portfolio. To do this, Arnault began his traditional strategy, which at the turn of the year 1999 was just a rumor. Nevertheless, on January 5th, De Sole called the investment bank Morgan Stanley's agent, responsible for Gucci's shares, to inquire if there had been any massive stock purchases, which the agent denied any unusual activity. However, a few hours later, De Sole received a call from Yves Carcel, the president of Louis Vuitton, who informed him that Bernard Arnault's holding company, LVMH, had purchased 5% of Gucci's shares. Despite the purchase, the idea was for the companies to work together cooperatively without major issues, and that there wouldn't be any further stock purchases. However, the CEO of Gucci knew from Arnault's track record that this was an empty promise. When he called the investment bank, he was told that his agent had gone on vacation precisely at that moment. Despite this, De Sole got in touch with Michael Zawi, the head of European mergers and acquisitions at the bank, to plan a defense against the French shark. Interestingly, Zowie had already battled Arnault for control of the Irish brewery Guinness, but without success, and this would be a chance to get back at the magnate. The two arranged a meeting to review a plan from Morgan Stanley to defend Gucci from Arnault's appetite. However, when they met, they were astonished by the content of the defense suggested by the bank, a two-line proposal which stated that in the event of a hostile takeover bid, Domenico de Sole could resign as CEO immediately and hand over the company, and that if more than 35% of the company's shares were purchased, the designer Tom Ford could also exit the business without any hindrance or contractual penalty. Thus, there was no defense plan within Gucci's bureaucratic situation, putting the company ready to be acquired by LVMH. After all, in the case of a hostile takeover, there were no safeguards to stop someone with deep pockets and the willingness to buy the company, which left it completely vulnerable. However, with almost no way out, a plan was born to thwart Bernard Arnault, fighting fire with fire. At the time, Gucci was worth $8.7 billion, a price that few could afford, but was nothing extraordinary for the Frenchman's appetite, and a sum that would take a long time for anyone else to raise. But time was not on the side of Gucci's owners. Just a few days later, Bernard Arnault had already acquired an additional 9.5% of the company. In 10 days, he had already gained a quarter of the company's shares, and despite Investcorp having the majority of shares, Arnault's behavior could soon put the Arabs in a difficult position. Desperate, de Sole personally called a series of shareholders, urging them not to sell their stakes to the French magnate. But this wasn't enough, and it didn't slow down the movement. He would have to personally talk to Arnault. That's how de Sole and Arnault met at Morgan Stanley to negotiate a truce, an option that would be accepted by the billionaire, provided that LVMH had 3 seats on Gucci's board of directors, a shark's offer. If he couldn't gain ground by buying shares, he would gain power and influence over the company's direction from within, and thus he would be one step closer to sabotaging the business until he could buy it, even at a lower price than planned. An offer obviously rejected. With no agreement, the battle continued. Arnault continued his plan and bought 34.4% of the company's shares. With just another 0.6%, he would automatically trigger the exit clause of the creative mind behind the business, Tom Ford, who could leave the company. With no way out, Gucci's CEO initiated a bold plan. He began issuing new Gucci shares on the financial market. Gucci didn't need money, but it needed a strategy to combat Arnault. The only way was to increase the number of shares in the market to dilute the Frenchman's stake. The strategy wasn't new, and in fact it was a risk that the magnate was already prepared for. This was because as Gucci had shares in the American market, it faced a limit. Companies could only issue a maximum of 20% of shares on the market without special authorization. And the French magnate had enough resources to deal with this possibility. In fact, he activated a provision in the company's bylaws to convene a shareholders' meeting in order to create a new uncomfortable situation within the business. But while he made his moves, there came the great countermove, still in late February of that year. Even though he was cautious, what Arnault didn't anticipate was that the dilution rule applied only to American companies, and Gucci was Italian. So Gucci made a massive issuance of 20 million shares on the market. This automatically transformed Arnault's stake into only 25% of the total, which would require time and more money to regain his previous share. The flood of shares provided an opportunity for another move when another rival of Bernard Arnault appeared, François Pinault. One of the richest men in France, Pinault owned various businesses such as auction houses and brands like Samsonite and Converse. And like another shark, he realized that a conflict was unfolding, and an opportunity. After meeting with Tom Ford and Domenico de Sole, the billionaire decided to become a partner of Gucci, with a generous investment in the company. In practice, Gucci would carry out a new share issuance, this time double the previous one. However, instead of taking over the business, Pinault would allow the former leaders to remain in control of the company, and the plan was even more extensive. In addition to paying $75 per share of the company, acquiring a total of 40 million Gucci shares, which would be issued immediately, the billionaire would also bring the Yves Saint Laurent brand under the umbrella of the Italian company. Interestingly, it was the same Yves Saint Laurent that Bernard Arnault had considered purchasing before pursuing Gucci. This operation cost $3 billion and gave Pinault 19.6% of the total Gucci shares. This move effectively halted Bernard Arnault's takeover attempt as he lost control of Gucci, which now had another of his desires, Yves Saint Laurent. Frustrated, Arnault tried to block the transaction through legal means and even claimed that as a prior shareholder, he had the option to buy the entire company at its market value before the dilutions, in an offer of $8.7 billion. Nevertheless, his efforts were futile, and there was no one to turn to. Outraged and with no one left to buy shares from, the magnate decided to sell all of his Gucci shares on the market, in an operation that concluded in 2-1. Since then, Gucci has nearly tripled its market value and now represents over half of François Pinault's group's annual profit. But despite the success, the significant achievement was that this situation marked the greatest defeat of the world's richest man. Will he ever manage to conquer Gucci? Share your opinion with us.